Welcome to Sociology of Work and the Professions, lecture number 4. Today we're going to look at the area of non-standard work, which essentially asks the question of what actually is work in the first place and how do we understand varying concepts which from certain angles look like work and from other angles possibly don't, such as slavery, volunteering, domestic work around the house, doing the ironing and the hoovering and the rest of it. We'll also do a little bit of essay support for the normative one. Now, at the end of last week's lecture, we touched on this quote from Durkheim, that the old gods are aging or are already dead, and others are not yet born. And as we said at the end of last week's lecture, just to recap that slightly, he wasn't talking about old gods in the sense of Zeus and Apollo and Jupiter and Canunus and so on, but rather the major ideals by which a society lives, which are referred to by the Hebrew term shibboleth, the sort of grand ideals of a society. So in 1912, he could easily have been referring to such concepts as patriotism and duty, the grand ideas of Victorian and Edwardian society. Those, in effect, he says, were dwindling away into insignificance and had yet to be replaced by anything new in 1912, but obviously we are now over 100 years down the line. So the question arises, do you feel new gods in the sense of great social ideals have been born to dominate in British society and possibly other societies too? There's no reason to suppose that all societies have to have the same grand ideals dominating them. If so, what are they? And that's something that when we meet up in the virtual classrooms on Tuesday, we can discuss there. So giving you a chance to have a bit of a heads up to start thinking about what you feel are the dominant ideals of modern society. Or you might take the approach that even in 2020, the new gods have not yet been born. Are we still in some sort of transitional state where we still haven't found any great collective ideals to live our lives by in British society, let alone in any other part of the world? That could be a matter for ongoing discussion. Your formative essay, the 1,000-word piece, which goes up on November 6th, the idea, as just to recap, is that you'll be doing your workplace visits. Now that is the question which we'll address also in the virtual classroom tutorial. Have you had a chance to organise a workplace visit yet to go along and observe somewhere? Now that could be, as we've said in previous lectures, that could be you observing your own workplace, if you, for those of you who are in work and have one, or it could be somewhere that a friend or relative works where they are able to sort of wangle it with the manager to get you allowed to come and sit in for half an hour or so and just watch the comings and goings of people. Whether for your own health issues or for ongoing changes in law, you feel that it's becoming very difficult to manage to actually sit in a place of work where other people are coming and going, you might decide instead to interview people that you know by telephone or by email or Zoom or Skype or some such thing, and at least conduct the interview part of the experience, if not necessarily the observational part of the experience, that way. Because it's probably the interview that will give you as much meat as the actual observation itself to hang your essay from. So the 1,000-word piece is sets out with a brief description of the workplace that you've observed, the working environment, and the kinds of comings and goings which hopefully you've had a chance to observe, and then picks up on issues from the interview you conducted with someone who works there, or indeed more than one person who works there. What have they said to you that you find to be of interest? Now, you're reserving the most interesting things they've said for use in the assessed assignment that you have to do later in the year. So this is the sort of secondary or tertiary elements they've said which are interesting but not as interesting as the thing you intend to make the focal point of your main assignment, your main essay. But the examples are given on the screen of possible things you could pick up on, such as for older workers if they're getting ready for retirement, what they are hoping to get in retirement, or if they're fearing it, worrying it, etc. It may be that the working environment you're looking at has undergone a process of automation with fewer and fewer actual living human beings working there, and more tasks carried out by robots, computers, various forms of artificial intelligence and so on. It may be people have been sent off on training days recently, whether that's a diversity training day or some other type of training day, health and safety issues or whatever else, customer service. And so you could chat to them about whether they found it worthwhile or pointless, or if there's elements of training they wish they could get that they haven't so far been offered. So you could discuss that angle. If it's a working environment with a percentage of migrant workers from other countries employed there, you could talk to them directly if they're willing, or if they're not, perhaps you can talk to a manager or another member of staff. What's it like to work with someone who perhaps English is not their first language? Are there concerns about wages being undercut, or do they really value those members of staff and think they're really good, hard, industrious workers and so forth? So just getting a general sense of the working environment. If the people you're talking to feel very stressed at work, how do they cope with that? Maybe they don't cope with it at all. Or maybe they have techniques offered within work or things that they try out in their own private time to help make their stress levels more manageable. And indeed you might find someone who's had a major change of career, who's undergone a new direction, and the career they're doing now is the new one, or perhaps this is the career they're about to leave and go off in a completely new direction and take up a new job entirely. So you could talk to them about sudden career changes and why they're doing it, what they get out of working there, what they don't get, so on and so forth. Okay, so any other questions to do with the assignments we can discuss in the virtual classroom? So we'll move from there to talking about this issue, which is the main topic of today's lecture, as to quite what actually constitutes work, how we understand this notion of work. Now, since the days when we were all living in caves, we've all had to carry out some form of activity or another, if that was hunting for food, or collecting berries and nuts, or gathering firewood, or going fishing and that sort of survival level stuff, through to much more complex tasks for which a wage might have been paid. All sorts of endeavours people get up to, but in different contexts, and so we don't necessarily always label those endeavours as work. In that sense, work is a social construct, it's a social concept, because we distinguish between things that are work and other types of activities which, for whatever reason, we don't class as work. And so that's the kind of area that we're exploring in this lecture, why some things constitute work and other things don't, how those understandings change. So for a lot of people, maybe getting a wage packet is the key issue. Do they get paid to do this activity? And if they do, it is therefore work. And it'd be interesting to see in the chat which of these factors you feel are particularly central to your understanding, to your lived experience of what is work. Some people get paid money, but maybe don't necessarily have specific things they have to do. So, for example, people might live off investments, and their investments pay them money, but they don't specifically do anything. They just get that income for investments. Is that work? Or must there be a particular set of activities that you do? So is there a manager, an employee who says, right, on Mondays I want you to do this, and on Tuesdays I want you to do that, and it's the completion of those tasks that determine whether or not you get your wage packet at the end of the month. Is that a feature of work? There are some things, quite a lot of things, that we do voluntarily. So people who go and volunteer at charity shops, or they help out at youth clubs or day centres for the elderly or the disabled, or all manner of other things, which they are willing to give their time to without any kind of remuneration whatsoever. And some of it can be very hard work. It can be intensive labour, sometimes emotionally quite draining, as well as on other occasions emotionally very fulfilling. So it can be quite a big chunk of someone's weekly existence given over to voluntary work. If there's no wage bracket, is it still work? I've just said voluntary work. That maybe is a misnomer, you might feel. Perhaps it's not work as such, perhaps it's something else entirely in a different category. Again, how do you understand that? Does work have to be useful to other people? The usual assumption, and we'll look at a definition as we go along which fits in with this, the usual assumption is that a service is provided that somebody else wants to gain. Making an object somebody else wants to buy off you, offering a service like plumbing or wiring up a house that someone else is willing to pay for that service to be provided. Or it may be entertaining people, singing songs, writing books, acting in a stage play that somebody else is willing to pay to listen to and to watch. So they're willing to hand over money for it. They feel it's worth the money to gain the object or the experience or the service, whatever it may be. Some people, conversely, may have jobs where they feel they're doing nothing remotely useful whatsoever. They're turning up doing something and it all feels a bit pointless. Can work be pointless in that sense, or must it always be contributing towards the greater good? Some people do jobs which involve a considerable amount of talent, something which they are perhaps very good at doing, they've got some remarkable skill. Other people might have jobs which involve hardly any skill at all, just pressing a few buttons or pulling a few levers, the sort of thing that perhaps a random person dragged off the street could be made to do. They are both to one level or extent work, but when we come back to this topic we've touched on in previous classes, the difference between, say, a job and a vocation or a profession or a trade, do these different terms imply different levels of skill? So is there an implication that, let's say, for example, a trade involves a different level of skill than a job? Or are these words mutually interchangeable? Some things have deadlines, other people maybe don't operate to any deadline, they just kind of trundle along. Does that make any difference to the nature and experience of work? If you have to turn up on certain days, or you have a certain amount of work to do on the days when you turn up and you can't leave until it's all done? Or could work operate in a much more flexible manner, where it doesn't matter how long it takes you to do something as long as you eventually do it, or it doesn't matter whether you turn up on a Monday or a Tuesday or a Wednesday, as long as at some point the work is done and you just kind of fit it into your own convenience? What about this final issue as to whether work has to be at a place of work, at a shop, a factory, a farm, a laboratory, a school, a hospital, whatever it may be, versus working from home, as not only during this coronavirus period that we've got started to get used to, a lot of us, but even before that there were people who would have jobs that they carried out in their own home, maybe making things that were then collected and delivered to some place of work, or addressing envelopes, that sort of thing, often not terribly well paid work, but things they could do whilst they were at home. Does it make any difference to our understanding of what work is, or the comparative status of different forms of work, as to whether it's something you do at home or something you do at a place of employment? Flashing back to what we were talking about some weeks ago, describing the impact of the Industrial Revolution of small-scale cottage industries, old ladies with spinning wheels making cloth in their own homes and then selling it on the marketplace, versus mills, huge great mills employing hundreds and hundreds of people who had to turn up there and work at the mill and then go back home again at the end of their day. Are we seeing changes in the notions of work? So just as work changed pre-industrial revolution to post-industrial revolution, with the impact of artificial intelligence, computing, the the world of information available to us through emails and websites and one thing and another, has this had a massive impact on changing the notion of what actually work involves in the 21st century? Now, during the virtual classrooms chat, hopefully I'll be able to get your views on this as to which of these you would class as jobs and why you class them as jobs versus the ones you don't think are jobs, and again, why don't you think they're jobs? So if it's a prisoner made to sew mailbags without any kind of payment to them, is that a job? If you've got a teenager with a really filthy, dirty bedroom and you end up bribing him or her with £5 to go and clean it, are they performing a job in exchange for the £5? Is that a wage packet? Or does bribery fit into a different category? What about the millionaire on the phone to their stockbroker? They're not breaking a sweat, they're not leaving the house, they're not necessarily doing anything in the conventional sense of work that we're used to, but they're earning money by giving, or possibly losing money actually, by giving their instructions to their stockbroker. Is it the stockbroker who's doing the work, or is the millionaire themselves engaged in work? Someone who's tricked into being a sex worker, most of whose earnings go to the individual pimping her, or possibly him on some occasions, but generally speaking her. Are they working? If they're being bullied, threatened, intimidated into carrying out the sex work, it's not a voluntary thing, which raises this issue: does work have to be voluntary to class as work, or can it include things that people are forced into doing? The woman there piling through mountains of ironing, it's her own clothes she's ironing, not anyone else's. Is it still work? I mean, it's time consuming, it's obviously it's a form of manual effort. She may or may not enjoy doing it. If it's for her own benefit, is it work? What if it was somebody else's clothes she was ironing? Would that make any difference to whether or not it's work? And in a similar vein, the man fixing his wife's car, she's not paying him to fix the car. He's fixing it for her. He's still got to use his skills, his time, his effort, and there's obviously a strong manual element to fixing the car. Is that work, or is that an act of love or affection or domestic necessity? How do we conceive of that? So get your feedback on that when we meet in the chat room. See how we go from there. So this quote from Crossman in 2017 fits some of the things we've just been talking about, but not necessarily other aspects of what we've been talking about. Work in sociology is defined as the carrying out of tasks which involves the expenditure of mental and physical effort, and its objective is the production of goods and services that cater to human needs. That fits some of the things we've spoken about, but not others. An occupation or job is work that is done in exchange for a regular salary or wage. So distinguishing work from a job as two slightly different things. Therefore, work could potentially include all sorts of unpaid activities, but a job specifically is one where there is definitely a wage involved, at least from Crossman's point of view. Do you agree? Do you disagree? We can discuss that in the virtual classroom. This is an issue raised by a philosopher called Michael Sandel, who says that introducing money to an issue can change the dynamic quite considerably. So an example he gives is the teenager who, or child, whatever age group, who willingly goes to visit their grandparents because they love their grandparents, and they go and spend time with their grandparents, talk with them, maybe they play board games or something or another. They're spending time together voluntarily, versus the child or teenager who really doesn't like their grandparents, doesn't want to go there, and only ends up going because mum or dad has bribed them and said, here's 10 quid, go and spend the afternoon with granddad. They've gone specifically in order to get the 10 quid. So does the introduction of money into that sort of scenario significantly change our understanding of what is going on? Sandel's argument is that there are certain scenarios, and that's one of the ones he highlights, in which people should not be paid money to carry out those tasks, in which they should only do them voluntarily rather than in exchange for cash. Other things he's quite happy for people to do in exchange for money, but he says on certain occasions it turns what should be a loving act into something mercenary. And that raises the question of whether work is, in some extent, if you're doing it for a wage packet, it becomes the job rather than work, to use Crossman's definition. Does the introduction of a wage packet introduce a mercenary element to the activities? The sense that I'm only doing this for the money, and therefore if there's no money I won't do it. How do we therefore understand some criminal issues, which obviously frequently are engaged in for money, drug dealing, fencing stolen goods and that sort of thing? It's a way of making a living. Is it a job? Is being a drug dealer a job? An illegal job, clearly, but is it a job nonetheless? Is being a fence of stolen goods a job? Is being a burglar a job? Because there is some financial gain from doing it, and presumably if the person didn't make any money doing it, they wouldn't bother dealing drugs or burglaring houses if there was nothing to be had out of it financially. Raises some weird and wonderful questions which we'll explore in the virtual classroom. We might ask what you think of as a good job. There have been various different definitions, and often the implication that somehow, at least in previous decades, middle-class jobs are better than working-class jobs because they don't involve some of the same features. So that we've got an example on the screen of getting grimy. The implication that a lot of working-class jobs have, historically at least, been manual labour, sweaty, grimy work where somebody comes home in dire need of a good scrub at the end of the day. Whereas middle-class jobs are much more, tend to be at least, more your paperwork jobs, sitting in offices where there's not much muck, not much grime, not much sweat. It's brain work rather than physical labour, physical exertion. Does that make one job better than another? Does it justify the comparative wage packets? Although, of course, these days plumbers and carpenters and so on often earn a damn sight more than office workers. And so there's been a significant change in pay structure when it comes to what used to be considered manual jobs versus desk jobs, office jobs, that sort of thing. What would you regard as something you'd be willing to do only for money? Wiping someone's backside. We were doing it on the assumption here that they can't wipe their own rather than some sort of weird fetish. If it's your own baby and you're wiping their bum, is that a job? If it's an old lady in a care home and you're being paid money to look after her intimate personal care, it's a job, you're being paid money to do it. Would you do that for let's say it's a very elderly relative who is no longer able to take care of that sort of thing for themselves? Would you do that voluntarily? What about strangers? What about people who have no relatives that live near them, that therefore need someone that they're not related to come and help with that personal care? Should that be a voluntary act to look after the elderly, or is it something that no one would willingly do unless they were paid money to do it? How do we contextualise these different things, these notions of what is a worthwhile job, what's a bad job? And again, what makes it good or bad? Is it the wage packet? Is it the nature of the work itself? Is it the sense that you're helping another person, or something else entirely? We'll explore these ideas when we are chatting away. So all of the things you got listed on there, domestic chores, volunteering, community service, slavery, involve quite often a lot of frequently manual work, frequently challenging, sometimes heavy duty work, but not necessarily anything approaching a wage packet. Volunteering doesn't involve being paid money. Court orders seldom involve paying money. Slavery, occasionally at some points in history, slaves have been paid but just very, very badly, a very low amount. Other points in history, slaves weren't paid at all. So it depends which culture we're looking at, which period of history. But these are all things people do which can be laborious, which by and large no money exchanges hands. Is it therefore a job? Is it work purely in the sense of stuff to do, tasks to complete? Or is it work in some qualitative sense, or some kind of experiential sense, where this is your function, your task in life, whether it's doing the ironing or digging ditches or feeding dogs at an animal shelter, whatever it might be, stuff that has to be done and you are the person who has to do it. Therefore it could be understood as work. And again, we're looking at what really are the defining features that make something either a work or a job and something else not. Now this is an issue we'll debate again in the virtual classrooms, but flashing back to 1975, Silvia Federici was a vocal exponent of the idea that women's work around the home, which back in 1975 was predominantly women who did the ironing, the hoovering, the cooking, the cleaning, the childcare, all the rest of it. She said that was most certainly work. It was what she termed invisible labour. So we might say, well, the husband works, he goes out to a factory or an office or a coal mine, whatever it is that he goes out to. But the wife doesn't work, she's a housewife, would have been a way of phrasing it back in 75. Except Federici said, well, actually being a housewife does involve a hell of a lot of work. It's not regarded as work, it's not classified in that way. Therefore, she proposed, and obviously it's never really happened all these decades on, but she proposed, maybe as much to make a point as anything else, that housewives should be paid for doing housework. Which then led to a lot of debate in the newspapers and on TV shows and what have you about whether or not this was the case and who should be paying it. Federici said the husband should pay, and then some other people said, well, what about the government pays it? What about this, that, the other organisation pays it? So there were various different stances taken on this, both by Federici herself and by other feminists and sociologists and thinkers coming at it from slightly different angles after she'd got the ball rolling on this subject. There are other questions that arise. Certainly in 2020, house husbands are more of a phenomenon than they were in 1975. So if a career wife goes out and it's the husband that stays at home and does the ironing and the cooking and the cleaning and the rest of it, should she pay him? So in other words, is this a gendered issue, or is it simply that in any couple where person A goes out to work and person B stays at home, that person A should be paying person B as an appreciation of their labour around the house? That would extend to same-sex couples. 2 men, 2 women. If one goes out and one stays at home, is the one going out responsible for paying the one who stays at home? What if they both go out to work, as is the case much more commonly these days than it was in 1975? Whether we're talking a man or a woman, or 2 men or 2 women, it's common enough for both partners to be working. One might be full-time, one part-time, or they both full-time or both part-time. So should it be the one who works the longer hours that pays the one who works the shorter hours, on the assumption that they do more of the housework because they're not at paid employment for quite such a long period of the day? Should it be whoever earns the most? Because of course their wages, the wages you earn and the hours you work are not necessarily directly related in that sense. So should it be the better off partner who pays the worse off partner to do the housework? If they get paid at all, of course, because some people rejected Federici's suggestion entirely and said it was completely silly, and housework should be done by one or both partners voluntarily rather than seen as some kind of thing for which a wage packet is deserved. Other questions have been asked: should it be a flat wage, or should it be per hour? So if you spend 3 hours a day on housework, you get paid 3 hours labour. Or should it be by task, given that you could spend 3 hours doing one single thing, an absolutely massive mounting and vining, or you could spend 3 hours doing 20 different things, which just don't take up as much time for each individual activity. So do you say, well, I will pay you such and such an amount to do the ironing, and I'll pay you a different amount to do the cooking, and I'll pay you a different amount to do the hoovering, or a flat rate for the lot? Because obviously if you are hiring someone as a professional cleaner to come into your house and do stuff, normally it's an hourly rate, and they will say, well, it will take me X many hours to do this mountain of housework that you've got here, and it'll cost you such and such an amount per hour. And then either you can afford to pay it or you can't. That's the working assumption behind paid cleaning. So should a housewife or a house husband be treated in the same context as a hired-in cleaner? Now, part of most jobs, waged jobs, is some sense of supervision, that there is a manager, a supervisor, someone in that vein who comes along to make sure you've done what they're paying you to do, whether that's stacking shelves in the supermarket, or teaching in a classroom, or carrying out brain surgery, or whatever it may be. Somebody checks in on you every now and then to see, have you done it? And if you haven't done it, or at least you've not done it very well, you've carried out your job but in a rather slapdash, sloppy fashion, then there's usually some kind of consequence to that, which might simply be that you're packed off to be better trained so you can not make the same mistakes twice. Or it may be they decide you're a bit crap at this job, so they'll send you off to work in a different department entirely. Or they might just dock you pay, or give you the boot and sack you. Now, if that's the case of paid work in the conventional sense, if Frederici's dream is ever put into practice, and housewives, house husbands are being paid a wage, should they be treated in the same sense? So in other words, let's say it's the husband, we'll stick to the 1975 example, does the husband come home and look at the ironing and look at the hoovering and look at the washed dishes and say, well, you've not done a very good job at that? And if he says that, what happens next, aside from probably one of the plates being broken over the top of his head? But should he say, well, I think you need to be better trained, I'm going to send you off on an intensive hoovering course so you can learn to do your domestic work more effectively? Or should he say, well, I'm docking your rate of pay because you've not done a very good job with the ironing? You can imagine the domestic arguments that would kick in if that ever happened. But the point being made by those who counter Frederici is that if you're going to treat domestic labour as paid work in one sense, do you treat it as paid work in all senses, and hold to the same standard as any paid job would be held to? So would you in effect get someone turning around and saying, well, that woman at the end of the street, she'll do the ironing for half the price you do it, you're sacked? Aside from ending up in the divorce courts, where does that one go? Obviously it's going to be a difficult experience all round, I imagine, but would these be the kinds of discussions that would end up being had if it is treated as a paid form of employment? If you've got to part with a hefty chunk of your wage to get all the hoovering and ironing and whatnot done, does this then push the working partner into working longer and longer and longer hours so they've got more of an income to use? And then, of course, the longer they're at work, the less time they have to spend on any domestic task, let alone spend being lovey-dovey with their spouse or spending quality time with their children. So would you end up creating more social problems, far from having husbands and wives living in harmony and parents and children living in harmony? Would you have a wage slave who is working ridiculously long hours to pay their spouse to do stuff and still try to have extra cash left over for other things? Or would people be effectively going to work in order to earn enough money just to pay their spouse and not have any left over? In which case, what really is the point of them going to work at all in the first place? Would become difficult. How do we evaluate housework? So if you've got somebody who lives in a tiny little cottage versus someone who lives in a massive great mansion. Obviously, the bigger the property, the more cleaning there is to be done. So would you be paying by size of property? What if it's in terms of childcare, whether you've got one child or 5 children, the more children you have, the more time, energy, effort, etc. that goes into them. So should more money be paid according to the number of children somebody has? Or should it just be a flat rate? Now, if it's paid by child or by size of house, or by the amount of time it takes to carry out certain tasks, then effectively you might be precluding a whole raft of men, millions of men perhaps, in low-paid jobs from ever getting married. Or, equally, millions of women in low-paid jobs from ever having a house husband, let alone men having a housewife, because they simply couldn't afford anybody else to take on domestic tasks. So they're going to end up having to be single, earn a living for themselves, and do their own household tasks as best they can by themselves. The population rate would inevitably drop. That may not be a bad thing necessarily, at least in the short term, because fewer and fewer people would be able to afford to have children. Would it effectively be making marriage and children a luxury of the well-paid middle classes, with the low-paid working classes consigned to a life of loneliness and childlessness? What would be the ramifications of this? Would depend entirely how you manage the system, if the system were to be managed at all and not written off as a bit of a nonsense. Amongst those who would write it off as a bit of a nonsense, we have Catherine Timpf, who, as per this quote here from her, says, "There are some things in life that you just do. Everyone performs labour that they don't get paid for." In other words, men and women and everyone. Walking to the store is labour. Going grocery shopping is labour. Some days taking a shower and brushing your teeth can feel like labour. That doesn't mean you get paid for it. So just because you're doing stuff that's boring and a bit a form of drudgery doesn't mean you should be handed a wage packet for it. That's her argument. Everyone has a home. How you divide up the housework between husband and wife, or 2 husbands or 2 wives as the case may be, is entirely down to them as a couple. But whoever does whatever, you can't be in a position of payment, especially if we're putting aside the 1975 view of the housewife chained to the sink and the husband at work. These days a lot of people share tasks. So let's say the husband does the ironing and the wife does the cooking, for argument's sake. Does he pay her to cook and then she pay him to iron? Which would get a little bit nonsensical after a while, as they're all paying each other for things left, right and centre, and so the money would constantly circulate round and round between them. What happens if your spouse has run out of money and can't pay you for a task? Do you refuse to cook the dinner that week? Do you refuse to do the ironing that week? All of these sorts of issues make the situation more complex, which is essentially why both Timpf and Sandel are saying it's crackers. There's an argument that people should be paid to do their own housework. It's their house, their spouse, their children, their domestic situation. They are the ones that should take care of it themselves, not expect either their other half or the government or whoever to be forking out cash in exchange for it. We've already touched on Sandel's arguments around this idea that attaching money to certain activities rather sullies or cheapens those activities, because his argument is that there are many ways of valuing a thing, valuing an activity of which money is only one. His concern is that modern society has got too obsessed with the value of money, as if that's the end all and be all of everything, so that people are less and less inclined to do things for love, for kindness, for personal responsibility, because it's fun, because it's good for your long-term health. And more we're saying, where's the money? Show me the money. He gives examples, he gives American examples, but I'll give you a British example of a similar thing. There was a trial run up in Scotland with pregnant women on a particular healthcare scheme who were being paid in shopping vouchers to quit smoking. So they'd be tested to see if they had smoked that week. And if they hadn't, and they'd stayed clean for another week, they'd get shopping vouchers at the end of the week. Now, should those pregnant women be quitting smoking for the good of their unborn fetus, and of course their own long-term health, or should they only be doing it for the shopping vouchers, which is a form of payment? Timpf and Sandel would say if they've got so little care for their own child and their own health that they continue regardless, that's their choice. They should not be paid. It's not the duty of anyone else to fork out cash for them to alter their behaviour. It should be something they do for reasons other than money, or in this case shopping vouchers. Or you might feel that the long-term gain of improved health is worth it, and worth splashing out a bit of cash in the short term to avoid splashing out much larger sums of money in the longer term. Moving on to the issue of slavery, we've said in previous classes that there are still many people around the world, something in the region of 40 odd million estimated, people in the world who are kept in conditions of slavery today. A lot of it in Africa, in China, Southeast Asia, India, and some of it in Europe, though nowhere near as much as used to be the case. So even though it's now illegal, it still crops up. But where people either historically were or currently are enslaved, it's rare. Ancient Rome is an exception to this, in that Rome, the slaves of Rome, were paid a tiny little amount. But by and large, most slaves are not paid much of anything. They're fed, they're watered, they're given a roof over their head, that's about it. There's no wage packet. Is what slaves do, therefore, a job? It's labour, whether they're digging ditches or working in a sweatshop or whatever it might be. It's certainly labour, there's no denying that. But is it to be conceptualised as a job, given that it's neither voluntary, nor, by and large, is it waged? So this raises the question that does work, or at least a job at any rate, have to be both voluntary and waged for it to be constituted as a job, as a form of employment? A large objection, obviously, to the notion of slavery is that it's brutal and awful and terrible, and this notion that one person can own another person, who is somehow therefore not really a human being but a thing to be owned, is morally objectionable. It's quite a recent view of humanity. I say quite, it's a very, very recent view of humanity, and hopefully one that will last the long term, but there's no guarantee it definitely will, and that we'll still be thinking this way in 100 years' time. We might not be. We might have reverted to slavery in 100 years, who knows? That's one of the key objections. The other objections to slavery are the two things I just mentioned, that it's not voluntary, that someone is forced into it. Now, arguably, there might be a lot of things that people get forced into, which we are willing to tolerate as a society, but by and large, slavery is not one of them. And the fact that it's not waged. Would it actually make it any better if, let's say, a slave owner paid their slaves 10 quid a day or whatever sum of money they might pay them? Would that somehow make it better than if they didn't pay them anything at all? Or would it be objectionable, equally objectionable under both circumstances? Something to get your opinion on when we are in the virtual classroom. Now, we mentioned Mikhail Bakunin 2 or 3 weeks ago, whenever it was, who started out life as an ardent Marxist, as a follower of Marx, although he ended up having a big rift with Marx and came to the conclusion that Marx was full of hot air and not living up to his own moral values that he preached, and they had a big rift. Bakunin became much more involved in the anarchist movement than in the Marxist movement. But to begin with, at least, he was a Marxist before the big split. He was the one who coined this phrase, wage slavery, to talk about people in Victorian factories and down mine shafts and so forth, who were paid but paid an absolute pittance. They were barely able to keep body and soul together. And even if they didn't face being tied up and whipped like the slaves of ancient Rome or the plantations in America and Barbados and other places, they would, however, face other rather brutal punishments if they tried to rebel against their employers, who were in effect their owners by Bakunin's reckoning. So they might be thrown out of a job with no reference and find it nigh impossible to get another job. So they might face homelessness, they might face starvation, their kids might be taken away from them and put into orphanages, all sorts of problems might happen. And the terror of those awful forms of suffering would be as bad as the threat of being whipped was to slaves of the more formal sense. Sorry about the phone. This is one of the drawbacks of working from home. I'm going to just wait for that to turn itself off.
Hello, your call cannot be taken at the moment, so please leave your message after the tone.
Sorry about that. Forgot what I was saying now. Yes, so according to Bakunin, these forms of slavery are as bad, no better, these forms of employment rather are not much better than actual full-on slavery. It's still a form of drudgery. Now we can look back at Bakunin's lifetime over 100 years ago now, and Marx's lifetime and so on, and see grotesque levels of exploitation going on in factories in Britain, in Germany, in Spain and France and Italy and all sorts of other parts of the world as well. The kind of stuff epitomised in Dickensian novels and the various films made of Dickensian novels. Do we still have that today? Do we still have that level of exploitation and awfulness today? Or has the world much improved? Has it significantly changed and moved forward? Are there people who can give up their job and say, this is a rubbish job, I'm going to walk away and find a better job, who can do that nice and easily? Or are there large numbers of people, if they lose one job, get sacked from it, or storm out and quit, will face poverty, desperate poverty, as a result of that decision? And therefore that threat, exactly the kind of thing that Bakunin was describing in Victorian times, does it still hover over people today? Is it large numbers of people that threat hovers over, or small numbers of people that threat hovers over? This is where we, again, can debate this once we're in the virtual classroom. Cicero mentioned on the previous screen as having talked about the horrors of slavery and the notion of being a virtual slave, kind of one step removed from slavery, even though technically you were a free person, that poverty meant that individuals were not much far removed from actual slavery. And in fact, in Cicero's time, some free individuals were actually worse off than slaves, in that slaves were sometimes better fed, better clothed, better housed than free people were. Which is why some people actually sold themselves into slavery if they were facing massive debts and poverty, because they would get a better standard of food and water and care from a slave owner than they would get being free and at their own devices, which is a fairly horrendous prospect if you think about that in any degree of depth or detail. One thing that Cicero talks about as the dignity of work is that when it came to the better off workers, the artisans, the craftsmen, the traders, the merchants and so on, they had a level of choice in their work, in that if someone wanted to hire their services and they didn't much like who that someone was, they felt they were a bit shiftless or distrustworthy or whatever, they could turn their customer away. They could make decisions about how much to charge for their services, who to offer their services to, at least up to a point at any rate. Is that still the case today? If you're self-employed, you don't have to take somebody on as a customer. That's certainly true. If you run a shop, you can turn away a customer and you don't have to offer a particular reason why you've turned them away. Again, to a point. Obviously, if you've got bills to pay, and here's somebody with money that's willing to spend it, even if you really don't like that person, and you feel that they're quite a dreadful person, if there's those bills hovering, you're almost certainly going to take the money off them and offer them the service. You're not going to be in a position to get too fussy about it. So is this a bit of starry-eyed romanticism on Cicero's part, or is having choice and independence and control of your work a key feature to having dignity at work? How does that translate into the modern setting? To what extent do we have, if you're an employee in the shop, you don't have as much choice over who you sell stuff to as the owner of the shop does. If you are a teacher in a classroom, you don't have as much choice over who sits in the classroom as a pupil than the principal or the if it's a privately run place, whoever it is that owns that school or college or whatever it might be, has over who they allow in as a pupil. So there's all sorts of, it depends where you are, how high up the pecking order you are, as to how much choice you have over who you engage with and who you don't engage with. Is that a key feature, having choice? Is it a key feature of feeling valued and dignified at work, or is it not terribly important? Something to discuss. One notion that has been proposed, and though it feels like perhaps a very recent idea, it's as such not, because it goes back at least to the year 1516, when it was proposed by Thomas More, is the idea of a universal basic income, which is often just referred to as UBI. If you're unfamiliar with the concept, it's the idea that every single person in society should be paid by government a minimum amount, just enough to cover basic food and rent and necessities. So what's the lowest amount that anyone could have to live off? Work out what that amount is, and that would be the universal basic income. So it's not paying people to live in 56-bedroomed mansions. Rather, it's paying them to have a very simplistic basic standard of life, on top of which they can then go and get a job and earn extra money to afford luxuries, if they want to, and of course if they're physically capable of doing so. As one of the reasons it's proposed is this idea that if somebody were to fall very physically ill or mentally ill, or have some other traumatic experience in their life where they were not capable of working for a period, then if there was such a thing as UBI, they would not be plunged into absolute poverty. They would still be able to afford somewhere to live and still be able to afford their bills and still be able to put food on the table and clothes on their back and so on. You wouldn't have people plunging into absolute squalid levels of poverty and desperation and homelessness, at least not for financial reasons at any rate. The quote there from Mingue about they must therefore find someone to hire them or die of hunger, is that to be free? Again, it's kind of a pre-echo of Bakunin's point. If your alternatives in life are drudgery or death, you don't have much choice, you don't have much freedom. It's a very, very, very limited conception of freedom and choice. So should dignified people in a wealthy society be offered more than that simple choice? Dennis and Maybelle Milner put forward the same argument again in 1918, so it keeps cropping up and cropping up from different people motivated by different ideologies, that some level of financial subsistence, because there is so much money in the world, in a world with billionaires and millionaires and so on, there are gargantuan sums of money, and if it were more evenly distributed, could everyone have at least a basic level of survival? And so work would then become a choice thing people do because either they enjoy the function, the job, or at least they want to have more money than the absolute basic because they want to go out and buy some luxuries for themselves or for their family. And again, a kind of another implication it would be that if you are stuck in a really awful job with a very abusive manager, you could make the choice to walk out of that job because you'd know you'd have that minimum level of survival income and take your time to find a better job, which perhaps would make abusive managers less likely to be abusive because they'd know they'd lose a lot of their employees if they were too unpleasant, and so they'd have to make the extra effort to retain their staff, particularly highly skilled staff who were difficult to replace at the drop of a hat. Philippe Van Prees says that minimalist UBI is not enough. It needs to be a more substantial sum of money to enable people to survive rather than merely scrape an existence. And again, he puts forward the idea that people should engage in work because they find it interesting, fulfilling, or simply because they want the money for the luxuries, not out of dire absolute necessity, the kind of thing that Lingwei is describing there, drudgery or death. That should not be people's choice in life, at least not in a civilized society. Other people coming from much different financial walks of life, like Mark Zuckerberg, who's one of the richest people on the planet, have argued the same thing but from a slightly different angle, a more self-interested angle. So for Zuckerberg and Andre Gotz, they see the future of a society increasingly automated with artificial intelligence machines doing more and more and more jobs that human beings have traditionally done, and so more and more people being unemployed. If vast numbers of people are unemployed, the enormous corporations can't stay in business. There's no point selling a product if no one can afford to buy it. You're not going to stay rich very long. Therefore, Zuckerberg, Gotz and various other people said in order to sustain the economy, during periods of very high unemployment, if everybody, not just the unemployed, but everybody had this basic income, then even those who were unemployed could afford to buy stuff. By being able to buy not only the absolute necessities, but perhaps a little bit more than that, that would keep the economy ticking over. It would keep the billionaires as billionaires, which I suspect is maybe part of the argument, but much lower down the economic food chain, it would keep a lot of other people in work. Because the danger of mass unemployment is that businesses collapse, because hardly anyone can afford to buy the goods and services that they're selling. Paul Valier makes the comparison between the introduction of slavery into North America, where previously the plantations had been worked by very poor white people, and then they were replaced by slaves from Africa, and chucked on the unemployment scrap heap. That had a massive economic impact. Most of them didn't stay permanently unemployed. They eventually did find other jobs, but not very well paid other jobs. One of the impacts Vallée highlights in the American South during that period of their history was that the financial gap between rich white slave owners, not all of them were white actually, there were some black slave owners and Hispanic and Chinese and so on slave owners, but by and large rich white slave owners and poor white people got wider and wider and wider and wider. And part of it was because those rich white people got even richer by sacking the white workers and replacing them with even cheaper slaves and treating them like absolute dirt. All they had to do was feed them and clothe them and house them, and that in a very minimalist fashion. So they saved a hell of a lot of money and created an awful lot of poverty. As well as exploiting the slaves, they created an awful lot of poverty amongst their former white employees. And so it had this kind of knock-on effect. And Valier is saying, are we going to see something perhaps a bit similar? So far from this vision of Zuckerberg where we all have basic income, are we going to see mass automation and replacement of large numbers of people with robots, eventually leading to a bit like the sacking of people to replace them with slaves? We'll see the sacking of people to replace them with robots. And yes, they might find jobs, but they're likely to be low-paid jobs, because fewer and fewer jobs will be available for human beings, as more and more jobs are done by robots. And so the robot will become like the 21st century equivalent of the slave back in the 1600s and 1700s. It's a bit of a grim vision, but that's a possibility being argued. Now, setting that aside, we'll go back to this idea of volunteer work and charity work and so on. Back in 2010, David Cameron, who was Prime Minister at that time, made his proposal, some of you may remember it, of the Big Society initiative, in which he said more and more people need to go out and not only work for a living, but also do voluntary work, because it's good for them, it's good for society. If everyone now goes out and volunteers for charities and that sort of thing. It was somewhat mocked at the time, and one of the reasons being that David Cameron himself and many members of his cabinet were not seen to be engaging in any voluntary work of their own, just kind of hectoring other people to go and do it. That to one side, the double standard element, is it a good idea? I mean, there are already a lot of people who do voluntary work without politicians needing to tell them to do it. But should it be more actively encouraged? Should more people go out and volunteer for charities and so forth? Or, as some people have suggested, does this put people out of paid employment? Because if an organisation can find someone to do it for free, what incentive is there for them to hire someone to do it? And so does volunteering actually reduce the amount of paid work available for people? Is it a good thing or a bad thing for the long-term economy? Get your views on that in the discussion. What actually constitutes as volunteering? And we'll go through these in the chat and get your view as to whether you think the very obvious examples like helping out in the charity shop, but what about things like babysitting the grandchildren or nephews, nieces, whoever? What about just helping out your next door neighbour because they're disabled or they're very elderly and frail perhaps? They can't do their gardening, so every now and then you pop in and mow the grass for them and do a bit of weeding and what have you. What about those who do unpaid internships? Usually financially supported by their own parents, but not by the normally very, very, very rich companies that are happy to take unpaid staff on. Is that volunteering? Is it an internship? Is it a glorified form of slavery? Quite what is it? How do we understand that? What about court orders that make people go out and do community service? Is that a form of volunteering, given that they're not really choosing to do it, they're being ordered to do it? But does it still consist and class as some type of volunteering? Because they don't get paid for it. How do we understand that? Or more to the point, how do you understand that? We'll discuss that in class. Now, ready for next week when we meet back in person. Uploaded to Brightspace is a paper called Changes in the Value and Division of Unpaid Volunteering in the UK 2000 to 2015. If you have a read through that and look at some of the stats quoted and some of the patterns, I'm not asking you to do a huge in-depth analysis, but just cast an eye over it and see if you're surprised by the figures, or maybe you're not surprised by the figures. What do you feel could be done to encourage volunteering? Do you think it should be encouraged at all? What about the types of people who engage in voluntary work? Just have a read through the paper and see what you think about it. We'll spend 10 minutes discussing it in class next week. That link will take you to an hour-long programme featuring Mary Portas, who's done several series on TV actually. In this one she's going into a charity shop and trying to sort of improve it as a business and shake it up a bit, and has various different reactions from the volunteers there. Some love her and some think she's dreadful, and how people understand what charity work is about, what volunteering work is about, who does it and why they do it. How should they be treated by the people who run charity shops and other such endeavours? What's the nature of the relationship between the volunteer and the actual company or organisation that they're volunteering for? So if you get a chance to watch that, please do, and then give me your opinions upon it when we meet next time. And when we do meet next time, we'll get onto this issue of how work shapes identity. Particularly we'll look at this notion of what has historically at least constituted women's work and men's work and how that's changing over the course of time. Obviously, these days it's very much changed compared to the way it was in 1970, but there are still certain jobs which are predominantly done by women and other jobs which are predominantly done by men. And social engineering doesn't necessarily change that a great deal. Should it? We'll be exploring that. And we'll also touch on ideas around social class and ethnicity with respect to the types of job that people do. But I'll leave that there for now and look forward to seeing you in the virtual classroom. Take care.